Next speaker is Joseph Poller, and after that will be Mr. Russ Brown.
Thank you, Chairman Liebman, and thank you, members of the committee. My name is Joe Poller. I work for Gilbert and Sackman in Los Angeles, where I represent labor unions and employees. I'm not here representing any particular group. I came because of the opportunity to participate in what I see as a historic and great process, the first open public meeting of this kind I can remember. I see it as a real advance in the rulemaking process because it gives everyone who has an interest an opportunity to meet and interact with the members of the board and to share their views and see the rulemaking process in action. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. I came here today to talk about two somewhat technical aspects of the rules that are proposed, and I think they're important. One was just addressed by the last speaker, and that has to do with the proposed revisions of the Excelsior List rules. The second I wanted to talk about, if I have time, is the proposed revisions to Section 102.66D, which would entitle a hearing officer to close a representation hearing if fewer than 20% of the members are involved in an eligibility issue. And the idea is you'd conduct the election, and then later on, if necessary, you would have the hearing to determine whether or not someone should be excluded or included within the unit as a supervisor or as a bargaining unit member. Well, turning to the first issue, the Excelsior List issue, as the last speaker alluded to, for decades the board policy has required employers, after a direction of election, to give the union a list of the names and addresses of all the employees in the proposed unit, or in the unit that's been ordered for the election. And the purpose is to give the union and the union adherents an opportunity to interact with their co-workers and to discuss the merits of unionization. That kind of list omits the important information that people need in order to communicate. It gives people home addresses, but it doesn't give email addresses or telephone numbers. And so it puts the union in the uncomfortable position sometimes of having to go to people's homes. Now, most people find that in this day and age a little bit annoying. They would much rather be contacted by phone or by email. And in areas like Southern California, it becomes almost impossible to reach all the parties by just planning on visiting them at their homes or even visiting them at the workplace. And let me give you a real-world example. This is a representation case that took place in January of 2011. It was a fair and square election all the way. Everything was done right. There were no unfair labor practice charges filed, no petitions for review. But the union lost the election. Now, this was a clinic that employed nurse practitioners in a large drugstore chain in Southern California and employed a small unit of about 30 people in Southern California area. Well, they were scattered. This is Southern California. Some people lived in Diamond Bar. Some people lived in Ventura. Some people lived in Long Beach. Some people lived in San Dimas. You had an area that was a 100-mile radius where these employees worked. Under those circumstances, it really became truly impossible for the union to visit everyone at their home. Making matters worse, the nurse practitioners would go from store to store, sometimes 3 or 4 different stores in a day, and the union could not show up at a particular work location and expect the employees to be there. So what happened was the union was in a situation where they never were able to effectively communicate the message. And this is what unionization and the whole process is about, giving people the opportunity to communicate, to speak with people about the merits of unionization. And that was lacking. And for that reason, I believe the union lost the election. So I think if giving people the opportunity to communicate with email by telephone is a much better procedure, and I think it would be welcomed more by the employees and certainly by the unions. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the 20% rule that's proposed under Section 102.66D. I think this rule should go a long way for ending a long-standing practice that hasn't been much publicized, long-standing practice in RC cases. Unions and employees don't like long hearings. Everyone knows that. For that reason, they often propose a stipulated election agreement very early in the process. They get with the employer and they try and determine whether they can come up with an agreed-upon list of employees who are eligible to vote, who may be in the unit, and who may be excluded from the unit because they're supervisors or managerial employees and they just don't belong. Now, The problem under the current rule is that the employers and unions both are tempted to do something which it goes against the purposes of the act, in my view. And that is they may try to horse trade to include certain people in the unit or certain people out of the unit for all purposes. And the union, in an attempt to get an election agreement, may be tempted to simply say that certain people are supervisors because the employer is willing to give the election agreement if that is done. This can work the other way around. Employees who are true, genuine employees can be excluded for one reason, just because there's one or two and maybe you just don't want to hold up the election. Well, the proposed revision to Rule 102.66D will solve this problem. If there are fewer than 20% of the unit that are an issue, as far as their eligibility to vote, you can get the election done with. You don't have to make this kind of a devil's bargain, either for the employer or the union, in order to get the election over with. And then I think once the election is over with, it'll conserve the time and resources of the agency, because most of these issues are likely to fall away once the election has taken place and the employer and the union have an opportunity to sit down and talk. Well, that's all I have. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I think this is an historic occasion, and I'm so glad to be able to be here the first time you've done it. I hope you do it again.
Thank you for being here and sharing your thoughts with us. Other questions?
Well, thank you.
I have a question about related to the 20% rule. You've probably heard some of the speakers say that they thought it was problematic that employers would not have certainty about who was a supervisor before the election was held, at the risk of certain people committing unfair labor practices, or even the flip side, the harbor side problem for unions. Could you comment on that?
You know, I think this is worth a try. I think this is worth trying to do and just seeing how it operates. One of the beauties of the rulemaking process is that by putting a rule like this in place, you can look at it, you can examine it and see how it works. I personally think it's going to cut out a lot of the problems that exist, and it's going to save time and money for the agency and the parties as well. Many times I've gone through lengthy hearings over supervisory status when it's been absolutely clear to everyone in the room what the status of the particular individual was. That's not true in all cases, but it's true in the majority of cases. The board law on supervisory status is pretty well settled at this point. So oftentimes I think that the issue is used as a delaying tactic, I'm sorry to say, by some employers, certainly not all employers, but some employers have used it as an opportunity to delay the election and to up the cost for the parties. And that's what I think needs to be avoided. The other problem, of course, is that it becomes kind of it can create a desire, as I said, on the part of the parties to try and cut things short. And so the union and the employer can try and make deals to include certain people and exclude certain people from the unit. You know what? The fair way to do it is conduct the election. If the votes of the purported supervisors are not outcome determinative in any way, then just certify the results. And if there's a real dispute later on, then you can litigate it. But why waste the time and money of the parties and the agency going through this process, which is often a charade, when it's not really necessary? That's my view.
Thank you. Appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
If I could, I just had one question relating to actually the previous speaker. I was just thinking in terms of the privacy considerations with respect to the expanded Excelsior material, should we think about, is there some way to empower individual employees to indicate whether they, and to what extent they wish material to be given over to any third parties with respect to their email addresses or their personal telephone numbers? We do have things like a do not call list that is there some kind of mechanism that we might want to consider that would balance the interests of individuals' privacy?
Well, certainly giving people email addresses and phone numbers is not a huge invasion of privacy anymore. Let's face it, most people know how to use a spam filter and put something in their spam filter. If they don't want an email, if they see who it's from, they can delete the email. They can answer the phone and say that they're just not interested in talking about it. Look, as far as I'm concerned, the most effective union member is the one who actually talks one-on-one with their coworkers during break time or at the at the work site when that's possible. That's the most effective way of going. And by the way, most employees have one-on-one relationships with all the people in the bargaining unit if it's a single location. So honestly, I don't believe that there's really a justification for the fear that giving email addresses and phone information is going to create some kind of invasions of privacy. I don't see it happening. But you know what? You can put the rule in place, and if it turns out that there's a problem with it, you can fix it later on.
I guess just one last thing. I was wondering if you had any views with respect to the different alternatives that were propounded in the rule with respect to blocking charges.
No, I don't have a view on that. I'm not prepared to speak on that today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for being here.